Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome, and it is warm, to our first Christians for an Ethical Society forum for 2022. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Noel and Lamb people, acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging, and to acknowledge that for thousands of years they have wrestled with many issues in a way that's better. Thank you. I did welcome you a bit. You're very welcome tonight. Thanks for that, Mark. I've just acknowledged acknowledgement to country. First, let me thank the Australian Centre for Christianity and Culture for providing the venue for tonight. We work in close association with Christians for an Ethical Society with the Australian Centre for Christianity and Culture. And Stephen Picard is retiring as its Executive Director at the end of March. He finishes up. And a new Executive Director has been announced. His name is and he will be starting at the end of March. It's very encouraging to members of the Christians for Ethical Society that Anthony was the chair of Christians for Ethical Society in Sydney, so we look forward to an ongoing close association between the Centre and Christians for Ethical Society. I'd like to secondly thank John Warhurst, who was President for the last 4 years. John Warhurst is Emeritus Professor of Political Science at the Australian National University and has contributed significantly to the life of CES over the last 4 years. Thank you very much, John. He's not here tonight, but I have already thanked him formally for the contribution he's made. We also have a former John's predecessor with us tonight, Professor Lorenzo. So welcome to all. And now I'd like to introduce our new president, Professor Ingrid Moses, AO. Professor Ingrid Moses has had an illustrious career in education. She has been Vice Chancellor of the University of New England, Chancellor of the University of Canberra, and has won many awards for her significant contribution to the field of education. She more recently was Chair of Animal Care for this region, including southern and western New South Wales. She holds an Officer of the Order of Australia, which was conferred in 2018. So I'll now pass over to Ingrid to say a few words about our program for 2022. Thanks, Ingrid.
Thank you, Clive. I to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today, the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respects to the leaders past, present, and emerging. Christians for an Ethical Society stands for values and voices in the public sphere. We are a Canberra-based ecumenical forum which seeks to engage with ethical challenges of the contemporary world, locally, nationally, and internationally. Each year, we choose a theme and try to find speakers to address it. 2020 and 2021 were years of bushfires, floods, and COVID, of human lives lost in the natural disasters, and of the destruction of wildlife and their habitats. COVID led to, for the present generations at least, on civil liberties, to isolation of residents of aged care facilities, families working and learning from home, businesses closing down, some permanently, and to severe travel restrictions, state borders closed down, Australia went into lockdown and lockout. Families were torn apart, and particularly older people died alone in isolation without any family with them. At times, only a handful of people were allowed at weddings and funerals. Church services were conducted by Zoom, and many events, including those of CES, also were Zoomed. We all became familiar with technologies we had not used before. Neighbors and friends offered help. But through the media, we have been learning about the many half-truths, untruths, fake news, and lies we were being told. At CES, we thought that this year might be the start of the new normal, not going back to life in 2019, but a new normal which acknowledges new opportunities for our society and acknowledges values which we and our politicians and religious leaders espouse. So our theme for 2022 is New Opportunities, Living for Justice, Compassion and Truth. Who better to start off the year than with a distinguished Indigenous academic and advocate for Makarrata, for farming as in good, who will be addressing two of the values, truth and justice. On Tuesday, 15th March, as per today, we will hold our deferred annual dinner at the Hellenic Club with guest speaker Genevieve Jacobs. Genevieve will speak on the role of the media in Australia today. Tickets are $50 per head, and they're still available, and there's a flyer back there. On Wednesday, the 18th of May, Archdeacon Tom Henderson Brooks, who has worked with underprivileged people, will speak about new opportunities addressing compassion. And in July, Justice Richard Shorty, acting judge of the ACT Supreme Court, will speak on justice. Dates and speakers for September and November will be confirmed later. If you're not on our mailing list, please list your details on the sheet at the front door. And now we look forward to our opening talk for 2022.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ingrid. I'd now like to introduce Professor Asmi Wood, and after Asmi has spoken, Felicity McCullum is going to speak for a few minutes, and I'll introduce both of them now. Tonight we are looking at the issue of Indigenous community with particular reference to the Uluru Statement from the Heart. It's a magnificent document. The Gettysburg Address is only 275 words, and the Uluru Statement from the Heart is less than 500, but it's a magnificent statement, and something I think everybody in Australia should read. And tonight we have two speakers to talk about that statement and Makarrata. So Professor Asmi Wood is Professor of Law at the Australian National University College of Law and runs the College of Law's Indigenous program. He is a barrister and solicitor of the ACT, and in 2020 he was the Indigenous Alumni of the Year at ANU. He's a Western Torres Strait Islander by ancestry, and he works closely with the Tagal Indigenous Higher Education Centre that supports students studying at ANU. It supports broad education for all peoples. His particular areas of research include legal ethics, constitutional law, humanitarian law, international law, and the treatment of Indigenous people within the legal framework. Asmi has won many awards for his teaching excellence at ANU. After Asmi speaks, and before our question and answer, Felicity McCullum, welcome Felicity, who is a PhD student at Charles Sturt University and also a Senior Research Officer of the Brotherhood of St. Lawrence. Her PhD is on Indigenous British engagement and reconciliation using the analytical tools and framework of René Girard. So over to you, Brett. Thank you very much for being here tonight.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you very much for inviting me here. I'd like to thank the Reverend Stephen Picard for inviting me here, Clive and Sister Rose as well. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this country, where we meet, the Ngambri and Ngunnawal people who have cared for country for tens of thousands of years in their own spirituality, in their own connection to country, and their own way of serving both their communities and those who travelled through this place, through the song lines that have existed for tens of thousands of years. I'd like to acknowledge my own ancestors and the ancestors of the various places on which we meet, both physically and virtually. We carry with us the past and we carry with us the hopes of the future. The topic that I was asked to address was truth-telling, justice, and the way ahead. Using the words Makarrata, which is the coming together of peoples after a struggle, maybe a war. I'd like to address each of these elements separately, and while surely we need to look ahead as to where we're going, it's important, I think, to see from where we've come, because where we come largely informs the way we tread moving forward. So the first element, the first element of truth-telling, I think, is vital, because as a lawyer, I know we use the terms legal fiction. Really, it means a lie. A legal fiction that this continent was not occupied by humans when the British first arrived, or the Europeans first arrived, is a legal fiction after all. But for most people, it is a lie. Either there was no one here, which is clearly not the case, or those who were here were subhuman, which is partly the way Aboriginal people were treated. The truth of Indigenous civilizations, the depth of Indigenous civilization, the flat structures of Indigenous civilizations should be recognized, I think, by civilized people. As many of you who believe in the Ten Commandments and do not worship graven images, I ask you to go around any square inch of this continent find carved images of gods or, it's not that Aboriginal people didn't know about them. East Island, 1,000 miles away, has 100-foot statues. Our people traded with them. They travelled across thousands of miles across the ocean. And they knew that people worshipped, stones. And I'm not saying that this is a good or bad thing. I'm not making a judgment on it. People need images perhaps to remind them of what they need to, but Aboriginal people didn't do that. They had a spirituality, a deep spirituality connected to creation. But this was seen by our colonizers who purported to follow the Ten Commandments as a kind of lack of civilization, not having the trappings of pomp and pride, were not seen as something to be valued, but the absence of these elements from Aboriginal culture was seen as a means for denigrating people who lived a simple, elegant life. People were not hungry on this continent. In fact, the amount of time that people spent in spiritual pursuit, song, dance, worship in ways which Western covenants perhaps don't recognize, and that's no criticism of anybody else. Aboriginal religions are not proselytizing by any stretch of the imagination. But yet, it is strange that newcomers to our shores who held values that they should have recognized as at least human, if nothing else, were put aside, and the legal fictions of an empty land, people without civilization, people who had no law, and people who were barely capable of being recognized as human, was what was entrenched in the law. Not everybody behaved in this way, of course not. There are many stories that go back to the meeting of civilizations, the exchange of ideas, the adoption of Christianity by many indigenous communities up in the north, in the Torres Straits. The coming of the light, or July 1, is the day that celebrated the coming of the Anglican Church. Our people were able to recognize the good in the newcomers, but the newcomers didn't have it in their hearts or in their minds to see the good in our people. And this led to a terrible series of clashes, acquisitions through force, the removal of children, and a manner that, a way of living, a way of conquering, a way of acquiring the land and the possessions and the lives and the dignity and the spirituality of another people. It's interesting that many Christians came to the fore to support Aboriginal people, but the powers that be also used religion in a way that was very destructive to our people. The truth about this, and there's more than one side to truth. I'm not saying truth is relative. I don't, as a personal belief, I don't accept that. I think there are truths and there are untruths. But there are also shades of understanding and truths from different perspectives. And this truth of all sides must be told. It's very easy to who say that the statues of Captain Cook should not be there. But really, Aboriginal people are not saying that. I'm sure some do, but the vast majority say, look, have your story next to this man, but allow the truth, the other side of the story, to also be told. If we think about how law entrenched the subhumanity or the invisibility of Aboriginal people, we go back to a case called Cooper and Stewart in the 1870s. And the case itself is quite interesting because while it has or had a huge impact in a legal sense on Aboriginal people, the notion of Aboriginality and the existence of Aboriginal people was an afterthought. Let me give you a short thumbnail sketch of this case that their lordships at the Privy Council decided. There was a gentleman called Cooper who acquired 40 acres of land in Sydney, and there was a caveat that said that should the colony of New South Wales require some of that land, that a part of that acreage would be resumed as part of the terms of the contract. And so everything was okay for several years. Mr. Cooper did whatever he did on his land for I think 7 or 8 years. And then the government sought to resume 7 acres of those 40 acres back for a public park. Mr. Cooper resisted, and he used a term of contract which is not basically that you can't have perpetuities or terms that are perpetual in a contract, and because the resumption would occur at any time in the future, that seemed to be indeterminate. And that was his first ground of appeal. And almost as an afterthought, I shouldn't say that because I don't know, I wasn't there, but it seemed to be almost an afterthought. He said, in any event, the Aborigines were the true owners of the land, had alienated the land to him, and therefore he was now the true owner of all 40 acres of land. The lordships rejected the first ground, but almost in passing, they said on the second ground, the Aborigines never owned the land. They could not possibly have owned the land, and therefore what was not theirs could not be given to somebody else. And so, entrenched into the law from the Privy Council, we have this notion of Aboriginal people not being able to own or manage land. I understand that English notions of ownership don't equate in an identical way with Aboriginal notions of custodianship and kinship and care for country, but the English and French and all the other colonizers had colonized other people with different faiths. I mean, just 1,000 miles to the north, or less than 1,000 miles to the north, was the kingdom of Sulu, where the Sultan had a different land law regime. The British were quite happy to, I don't know whether they were happy, but they certainly accepted this notion of land ownership, alienation, and use under a different legal system. They were able to do that, but somehow they could not find it in their hearts, I think, to extend that same courtesy to Aboriginal people. And the invisibility of Aboriginal people then led to a series of disastrous encounters because new settlers, as they came in, were hungry for land, and fortunately for people like myself who come from the desert, this is not very attractive land for Europeans. similar, I guess, to the era that they had left behind. The consequences were incalculable. But the resilience of the people in the South is evident because the people are still here, they're still strong, they still carry on their ways, they speak a different language perhaps, they follow a different religion perhaps, but deep inside, that care for country, the notion of who they are, carries on, and it's strong in them. And I think as other people from other cultures begin to see this, I think there's a glimmer of recognition that maybe these Aborigines who were so denigrated were perhaps not identical with the thoughts that they had about these people in their minds. Makarrata is the coming together of people after a conflict, a period of strife. I think historically there's no doubt that there was a period of strife, as there was competition for land and labour and women, because Aboriginal women were perhaps attracted to European men, because we know that many of them bore children to white people. But this competition was never recognized as a competition. Under the international laws of Europe, there were only three ways of acquiring territory. That was conquest, which British didn't claim, cession, which the British didn't claim, and then settlement. Because settlement was the option, and settlement before the International Court of Justice, which looked at this notion of terra nullius in the Polisario area in North Africa, and it was a notion that was rejected by the International Court of Justice. And so I think it couldn't be held by an Australian court that Australia was terra nullius. This is not to say that the Mason Court, which ultimately overturned the notion of terra nullius in Australia. I mean, these were wonderful people, people of deep faith, people who were trying to be just and also trying to be true to their own legal traditions. I think it's a very difficult thing to do. I mean, I can't imagine what it would be like for somebody who was so deeply imbued with the English notion of the law, equity and justice, to depart so radically from the ideas that politicians and the body politic, as the High Court spoke of, had entrenched into both society and the legal system. And yet in 1992, the High Court said that this notion of terra nullius was wrong at law and it was wrong at fact. So you would think now that the way ahead should be easy. Maybe it's easier, but perhaps not easy. Because even though the notion of terra nullius was expunged from Anglo-Australian law, the impacts of terra nullius still remain. So if the law or the highest court in the land says, no, the land was not empty, there were people here. But if there were people here and they own the land, why don't you give it back? I mean, that would be, I think, the logical next step. I understand that it's not possible, to create new injustices for a whole group of people who were descendants of people perhaps who did wrong, but in any event, these were not the people who created the injustice. But having said that, the injustices of the past through intergenerational trauma still feed through Aboriginal communities. And we see very little understanding of this from the majority of the community. I've heard many people say, just get over it. And yet, the Anzacs are celebrated endlessly, a disastrous war which, the English lost, are celebrated, everything that went wrong was involved with the Germans, and the Germans were the war criminals. Just imagine if the Germans had won the war, it was people like Churchill who would be the war criminals. These are political statements that have very little to do with the war. Winners write history and the losers suffer it all. And yet, this version of English history persists and continues. And even though some of the legal fictions of the past have been expunged from the law, not yet from society and not yet from our history books, the injustices of the past do continue. I don't want to end on a sad note. I think humans are capable of change. Humans are capable of doing what's right. And I think in societies where individuals can exert pressure on political communities to make not retribution as such, but to rectify what was patently wrong and to do it in the best possible way. Maybe we can do this through treaty. Makarrata, you can call it whatever you want, it's a Yolngu word. There are 200 tribes on this continent, and I think you can take your pick of which word you want to use for treaty, or, as I have written, multiple treaties, because as on the continents of Asia or Africa or Europe, there are people with superficial similarities but with distinct cultures, languages and histories. So too this continent has people with a multitude of languages, cultures, histories, with some similarities. So if treaty or treaties can be used to bring justice, to be used as a legal framework for creating justice between peoples in the notion or the term of the Charter of the United Nations, then perhaps there is a possibility that with time, with truth-telling, with justice, that the several sides or the many sides that need to come together to form a meeting of minds that is based on justice, that is based on truth-telling, and it is based on hope for the future, might be a possibility. And I hope that this is the way ahead for the many peoples who are now occupying this continent. So thank you very much. I think I've reached my 30 minutes and I'll leave you there. Thank you.
Brother Asmi, and thank you, Professor, for that very important address. In responding, I'd like to start with an Awabaka word, Allah, which means hello, and I'd like to acknowledge my Awabaka ancestors. Bo Waika Kakiliko Awabaka. And I join in honouring the ancestors of all First Peoples in Australia and the Torres Strait, especially of Ngunnawal and Ngambri, on whose lands we meet. I offer respect to leaders, past, present and emerging. Thank you, Professor Wood, for guiding our eyes to the international, transcending just the local, for opening a bigger arc so that we can see better who we are, where we are, and who others are in our lives and our world. Thank you for modelling a way into the deepening of this wider context, for modelling that in a way, this way makes good sense, for demonstrating to us the desire to engage seriously and unswervingly with this as a proud Torres Strait Islander man, always having an eye on the meta-context of the decolonising field. This is crucial knowledge, and these are vital skills to see from the meta view. Australia, in its remoteness, is not on its own. And this has been part of the problem, and is part of the problem in us reconciling who we are. But we are connected to an international context, and it is essential to impart and circulate the skills in how to engage with that to current and future generations of Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians for this particular arena. The healing consciousness that this brings is not just for now and for the future generations, it's also for our ancestors. If we are to broker a peaceful future for an Australia that is ongoing, deepening in peace, we need to have this sophistication, and we need not to forget who we are. So thank you, Professor Wood, for the precious gift of wisdom about the way that this diplomacy needs to pivot. And what I will call a nation resuscitation can take place, the chance to breathe and to find our feet again, post the liberative chaos of Australian and Torres Strait Islander First Peoples, having experienced the British imperial invasion. Thank you for making it clear that what happened and is happening here is not casually, it is not what is casually ranted as, just like what happened everywhere else in the world where stronger people invaded and there were some people that lost out. That's not it. That is not it. Rather, I would propose, from my research as well, that what happened here could be argued to be an unrecognised, state-sanctioned genocide. And the black deaths in custody that are getting worse every day are a further exacerbation of that horror. Without a reflexive awareness that we are part of an international community that is holding us to account, indeed that we are part of a multi-generational community, again, who is holding us to account, without awareness of the gaze of these larger harbours, of these contexts that could be levelling us, too often the realities of what had taken place and the structural racism that keeps it going are brushed over, whitewashed. Thank you for showing us that the moronic caravan of forgetting what has taken place is not the way forward. An ethical society, a Christian society, flourishes to the level that it wakes up, stops forgetting, behaves like an adult, and remains, so that it can actually fall into communion with itself. Thank you for reminding us through reflection how the first people of other Kansas countries not only accomplished miraculous preservation of cultural heritage and sacred connection to their ancestral places, which helped maintain their experience of their human dignity in a contested cultural relativity, but also to the ways the first peoples of those same countries have made mistakes. In fact, we talked about this a little bit more yesterday about the mistakes that we could be learning from that have happened in other places around the globe where the British have invaded as peoples try to work out truth and justice commissions, etc., etc. The warnings are in the pitfalls, and in compassion and with academic rigour and enthusiasm, it is good that we listen. It is good that we connect. It is good that we compare and navigate our way forward. So it was lovely to speak about this yesterday, Professor Wood, in our preparation for our time tonight with this community, and about the importance of theology and religious motivation or spiritual dimension for a way ahead for recognition of our First Peoples. As a Girardian scholar, I have heard my friends who are researchers caught up in peacemaking in Northern Ireland, Rwanda, and most recently in the matters of the truck blockades in Ottawa, Canada, say it is the relationship that matters. It's every relationship that matters. It's the personal ones, the public ones, the private ones. It's all the relationships that matter first. Then we can get the economics right. Every single individual relationship matters. The Indigenous and the non-Indigenous relationships here matter. My Awabakal ancestors modelled a way of turning towards the non-Indigenous people around them, which was part of our ancient law, to welcome the stranger, Benedictine, to celebrate and dynamically adapt when new people join our place. An Indigenous cosmology and a Christian spirituality converge in the realisation of a loving Creator who transcends our constructions of an enemy Allah and transcends the self-consciousness that we so readily get caught up in our coexistence together. So in closing, your presentation, Professor Wood, has commissioned us to engage with a larger field of understanding when it comes to our collective dharma, our right action, of Makarrata, truth-telling and justice for First Peoples, because it's all peoples here in Australia. In drawing this out so wisely, elegantly and simply, you show and pronounce real possibilities that grow justice for First Peoples and birth justice for all in the world. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Felicity, and thank you, Professor Asmi Wood. We'll now have a time of question and answers. There's a microphone over here. I would ask that you ask questions rather than make a statement or speeches. We have to, you can either ask to Asmi or to Felicity. But if I might be allowed to ask the first question. I've just been reading Sean Kelly's book, The Game, which is on Scott Morrison, and trying to decipher who Scott Morrison is. Quite a task. About halfway through the book, Sean Kelly deals with the issue of the view of Scott Morrison and the government to questions of reconciliation, but particularly the Uluru Statement from the Heart. And let me just read some wonderful words. I was surprised how beautifully these were put by Sean Kelly. The Uluru Statement from the Heart had been agreed upon after formal discussions lasting 2 years at a meeting of Indigenous people in the great and sacred rock Uluru, in the middle of the desert, in the middle of Australia, on the 50th anniversary of the 1967 referendum. The statement connects present harm to ancient wrongs and calls for redress and repair. One form that should take, the statement says, is a voice for Indigenous Australians enshrined in the Constitution. In the plainness of its language and the clarity of its arguments, the Uluru Statement of the Heart is one of the most beautiful documents in Australian history. It has the potential to be one of its most significant. Can I ask both of you why you believe that the document was treated with such virtually immediate disdain and characterised as seeking a third chamber and hence dismissed?
Thank you very much for the question. In a community where there is a high level of rivalry and tension, the way that unconscious behaviours happen before in the mayhem without careful reflection is both regret and it's almost hard to explain because in that combustion where people have allowed the degeneration of their living together, coexisting, to become so, I feel word insane comes to me, but so unbalanced, their resources in terms of accessing, see, according to the Girardian work, the opposite of mental illness is not mental, it's not about, it's wisdom. It's not mental health, it's wisdom. So the reaction, and there's a difference between a reaction and a response. The reaction and the claim that it was a third chamber was inane, it was absolutely nonsensical. That was not at all in the configuration or the concept of what was being pitched. So it's always difficult to explain why another person in their madness behaved like they did, so I don't know that I've done that well. I've attempted to try to explain how in a community of people who have been so that they haven't cultivated peace sufficiently, that this kind of collapse happens and puts us back very, very far into as a civilization.
Thanks.
Thank you for the question. I think the issue is that the statement was written by poets and interpreted by lawyers. It's not a very good mix. The language is elegant, it's beautiful, it's inclusive. But if you try and read it as a statement of law, of course it's going to fail. You know, for example, the statement talks about a shared sovereignty in places, even though it says sovereignty was never ceded. That is unacceptable to most Aboriginal people. I mean, something that Aboriginal people have held all the way through is that sovereignty was never ceded, and holding on to that idea from an international legal perspective is very important. I'm not quite sure where they came up with the third chamber because there are 3 chambers in English law, and these are people who purport to know, understand and propagate English law in an Australian context. So I think there was a bit of poetry on the other side as well. I think I can use a different word, but I think I'll just speak poetry.
Other questions? I invite you to go to the microphone and ask questions.
Thank you very much for a very illuminating series of talks. I have a simple question. Where where do we go from here?
Thank you for the question and thank you for the lovely acknowledgement as well. Where we go from here, as in we take whatever steps we have to become people of good conscience, justice and peace. Because in the orbit of our own lives, we are essentially making changes. So if every person was awoken to the impact that we had just in our everyday relationships, there would be a lot of progress made. I think you're actually pointing to something that is to do with political and legal aspects, and I'm going to hand that to Professor Wood.
The simplest questions are always the hardest to answer, because the question is, the answer is, I don't know. And the thing is, most people don't know. What we do know is that when we see wrong, we have to make it right. How we make it right is a question not just for us, but for the future. I think 200 years of being neglected, our wisdoms and knowledges and spiritualities having been destroyed, our kids not having had access to education, has set us back. When you negotiate a treaty or a series of treaties, there's more than just the word treaty that is needed. We need to understand what is it we want, what is fair and just in circumstances, because times have changed. How do we build trust to enter into agreements that are abiding? How do we ensure that as circumstances change, treaties or agreements can be adapted so that we don't bind our children to the wisdom or the follies of our present times? And what would allow the many sides who come to the table to negotiate walk away feeling none of them have been taken as fools or have been given something less than what they should have got? So the international community deals with these kinds of almost intractable problems on a daily basis. We have, 200 odd countries in the world who have to negotiate with each other. The international community and the legal fraternity, and I'm not saying that all solutions are legal, but I think you need to have law that underpins agreements so that we have means of ensuring that there is fairness in the process, that we have continuity in the process, that we have adaptability in the process, and that force, coercion, or dishonesty in the process can be identified and rectified. So I think our young people certainly are availing themselves of the best education that Western civilization has to offer. I think rushing to treaty now is not a good idea. I mean, this is my view, and I know that many people will disagree with me. I think we need maybe 40 or 50 years to allow our people to recover, for a knowledge of themselves, to recover their own self-identity, to understand the world in which they live, and to have the skills to negotiate treaties that are fair on every side. I think these things will take time, and while I don't know the answer to your question of what we do now, perhaps have a little bit of patience and give people time to be ready to negotiate and and to negotiate fairly.
Good evening, and thank you, Professor Wood, for your wonderful speech. Talk. Two questions. In 2022, what role does the Tent Embassy play here and into the future? And the second question, you mentioned that possibly up to 200 different treaties. Would that really work? Thank you.
Thank you for your two questions. The role of an embassy, whether it's an Aboriginal embassy or otherwise, I think is to remind people of what it is they should be doing. You know, it's the promise of unfinished business and the promise of a future where, you know, every embassy in the world, whether it's an American embassy or a Russian embassy, are here to remind the people who are walking past that, yes, these people exist, they are human beings and they need to be treated with a dignity, and anything that is omitted from the collective history needs to be recovered and made good in the case of Aboriginal people. So the Tent Embassy, I guess, the fact that they call it an embassy is tongue-in-cheek. You don't have an embassy on your own land in international legal sense anyway. But it is a tongue-in-cheek response to the history from which, you know, which these movements originate. Everything has a time and everything has a place, and I hope that it served its purpose of reminding people that there are people on this continent who are treated as strangers in their own land, and it's time to replace the embassy with a series of agreements or treaties. So the second issue is about treaty and how we can have so many treaties. It'll be more than 200 treaties, you know. Wiradjuri people, Gunditjmara people, and Ngarrindjeri people, for example, and there are many others, have already started entering into agreements as between themselves. A multiplicity of treaties itself is not a problem. I mean, if you look at the UN treaty series, like God knows how many treaties there are, I don't think that is a problem. For small communities to have the resources to enter into treaty and to enter into fair treaties that are enduring is an issue of skill, and that's why I was suggesting that perhaps we need time so that young people from all these communities can learn, understand and acquire the skills necessary to enter into a treaty or into a series of treaties. But there are also questions about how and what it is they would like to put into treaty, and again, this requires a degree of political sophistication and legal understanding. And I think time will help to resolve these problems. Not every community would want to enter into treaties. Self-determination means each community will determine for itself what is best for its community. This is not a strange concept. I mean, the English had 6 colonies on the continent, and they agreed to come together. The Federation is a kind of treaty. It is an agreement between the colonies to cede a certain amount of power and to acquire or to move a certain amount of power into the centre while retaining power for themselves, plenary power for themselves. This is a kind of treaty, and it's a great model. So federation is a possibility. you might not want to have 200, federated states in a small country with a 25 million population. But there are many ways of doing this. The Americans have 51 states, 300 million people. So I think there are many possibilities, and I think what we need to do is to be fair and use our imaginations to try and find a solution that works best for people. So thanks.
Thank you for the question, and thank you for those insights. That resonates. There are three things that I've got to say at the top so that I don't forget them. The first thing is local, the second thing is light, and the third thing is visibility. And what I wanted to emphasise is that for First Peoples, or for Indigenous Australians, the local is our specialisation. So we are connected through our family system, we're connected through our connection to our country, we are very familiar and we're very engaged with that way of conceptualising reality. This sense that there's this larger continent kind of caper, that's a little bit a different sort of matriculation from where our greatest power and specialisation is, and our greatest wisdom. I have cousins who go with archaeologists on artefact digs, and when they go over that so-called Hunter River, Kokan is what we call word, when they go over that river to Worimi country, they know nothing. They know nothing. Intuitively, it's all a mess. But as soon as we're on what we call country, there is a lot of cross-generational, epigenetic, triggered, DNA awoken knowledge that we have about our home that we belong to. So when we talk about there being such a complexity of First Peoples in Australia, that's something to be celebrated, it's something to wrap our brains around, and something to get sophisticated about. Just because we don't get it now doesn't mean that we won't ever get it, or that somehow it's going to be a puzzle that's not worth engaging with. Didn't Einstein say that you have to actually, you don't know the answer to the problem, you've got to change the whole approach to get your solution. You can't do it with what you started with. So that's kind of like where we are now. So I just want to emphasise the local in terms of this resolving this issue, and emphasise and implore an interest in that. As an academic, dare I say the phrase, myself, I'm always tempted to go through a large lens. But that's not the way. If you want to get really clever with understanding the epistemologies of Indigenous Australians, take the time, pull it back, focus deep, and listen to just the simple and the very, very local. So light, I wanted to mention, just that the light that is in, I think that when we're looking for how is this going to happen the way forward, all of our great leaders in our religious and spiritual traditions have spoken about the way that the consolation or the light will guide us. And I sense that if we can listen to our hearts and observe the movements and the callings, remember God says, behold, I make all things new. And then if we're willing to follow that, then we'll know what to do next. Because we are co-creating together. We are truly brothers and sisters who are forming our new day. And the other thing is visibility. I just want to emphasise that one of the most important things, and Professor Wood, Brother Asmi, said it very clearly, was this dreadful invisibility that was forced onto my ancestors who are Indigenous and our First Peoples. I can't tell you the pain that's caused. I can't tell you the way that support, to be genuine, to be loyal, to be vigilant, to show up, to vote for the politicians who get it really clear, who are not going to be corrupted, who are going to drive this to where it's got to be, which is in integrity, because that is a nourishing soil for everybody.
Do we have another question?
Yep. Can I join others in thanking you just so much for your presence and your contribution, what you said for us, and the work that you put in to your lives and to this evening's presentation. I've got a difficult question concerning Aboriginal people in custody. We're just conscious of the disproportion with the population. Personally, I think Aboriginal people seem to be put in jail for much less serious matters than non-Aboriginal people. And we're conscious of the fact that it makes a great difference to a family and a small community if one of their members is in jail. Have you got some suggestions as to how we can move this area to a more equitable and just and loving situation? Thanks.
Thank you very much. That's a very powerful acknowledgement. Thank you. Black deaths in custody and the obscenely high rate of incarceration of our Indigenous peoples has to stop. I mentioned earlier that there are some researchers that I collaborate with overseas, and I described to them that since the Royal Commission, where there have now been over, I think it's 480 uninvestigated black deaths in custody since the Royal Commission into black deaths in custody. I explained to this fellow researcher in Northern Ireland what was going on, and he was listening. And he said to me, "What you have said to me has just knocked me over." And I was just rallying, I was just sort of going through the list of details. And I said, "What specifically, Duncan, what is it?" And he said, "They haven't taken the pegs down." I said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "Those fans where they know the prisoners have been hanging themselves, they were required to take those down right back when that Royal Commission happened, and they're still there. They're still there." So the way that it's going to change is when the whole population of Australia changes in terms of being aware and acting on this. I've written with, the ABC. The ABC is absolutely the Religion and Ethics page, extremely committed to illuminating and doing what they can to address this issue, to bring light to it. I come from Cessnock. Cessnock has the biggest jail in New South Wales. And when there's a death in custody, no one's ever consulted us about that jail, and no one's ever realised the impact it has on our health, because our country feels it and we feel it when these deaths happen. So the way to address it is truth-telling. The way to address it is to get upset about it, to feel it, to realise it, not to move away from the discomfort on it. It hurts. But if we can bear it, Australia can bear it. Yes, it's hard. It's about Australia growing up and dealing with these matters.
numbers that the sister spoke about are horrific, and yet it's almost commonplace to recite these numbers as if, I don't know, counting sheep or whatever. The Americans very eloquently said, if you keep doing what you're doing, you're going to keep getting what you're getting. Since the reports on Aboriginal deaths in custody, very few of the recommendations have been put in place. And if that was not bad enough, things like mandatory sentencing, which look very appealing to people who don't really know anything about the law, help politicians, to be tough on crime. And I don't know whether they're racist or not. It's hard to tell, but I think they're opportunistic in terms of what they do in terms of the politics, being tough on crime. So let me give you an example of how mandatory sentencing might work. I'm not saying Aboriginal kids don't do wrong, of course they do. Some of these kids are 10 years old. Our age of criminal responsibility in Australia is 10 years old. A 10-year-old child is treated as a criminal. So, say an 11-year-old child goes into a shop and steals something. I'm not saying that they shouldn't. They should do things like that, but if they did. Most people think that that's a single crime. But when the charge sheet is brought against them, there might be 6 or 7 charges on the charge sheet: unlawful entry, stealing, intention not to return a person's property. There are multiple grounds. Normally what you would do when you're running a prosecution is to run a prosecution. If you get your first ground, then you leave the alternatives. But when people plead guilty, which a lot of them do because they have no idea what they're pleading to and they don't have legal advice in many cases, the 3 strikes occurred the first time round, and so, they get put in, get a custodial sentence. Another area is where services are not available, so say driver's licenses. People in remote communities need to have tests to get a driver's license like anybody else. I'm not saying that you shouldn't do that, but there aren't road traffic people where you can go down to, half a mile down the road, you get your driver's license and then you're okay. People have to wait for sometimes 6 months to a year before the circuit people come around. And in the meantime, people are still driving because there's one car and people have to take their parents to hospital or their kids to school. And the police give them, driving without a license notice, and several notices. Suddenly there's unpaid fines and they're put into prison. So there are many avenues into the prison system which perhaps need to be looked at. Justice Matthew Myers, a justice of the Federal Circuit Court, he, as persona designato, wrote a report for the Law Reform Commission on this. I think it makes really good reading. He's an Aboriginal man from, I don't remember his community, and he's going to kill me for forgetting that. But he wrote this amazing, deeply researched piece of research in which he had some simple recommendations. But I think getting politicians excited enough to do something is a difficult thing to do, because there's no political benefit in this, and that is the problem. There is no political benefit in solving these problems or remediating them.
What a wonderful evening, and thank you so much for extending that. Thanks. I'll just read a small part of the Uluru Statement from the Heart on there, which really addresses the last question. Proportionately, we are the most incarcerated people on the planet. We are not innately criminal people. Our children are alienated from their families at unprecedented rates. This cannot be because we have no love for them. And our youth languish in detention in obscene numbers. They should be our hope of the future. These dimensions of our crisis tell plainly the structural nature of our problem. This is the torment of powerlessness. Thank you both so much for this evening. I don't think I'll ever forget that statement you made, Asmi, about the interaction between the white community and the Aboriginal community, that the Aboriginal community could see the good in the white community, but the white community could not see the good in the Aboriginal community. That was a very powerful statement. And Felicity, the importance of relationships, just how vital they are. I think a major learning for me tonight has been patience, that these issues are not going to be solved overnight, that we do need to engage in dialogue, and we do need to be prepared to tell the truth. And that means calling out lies. And one of the purposes of the Christians for an Ethical Society is to have evenings such as this evening, where truth hopefully can be told. Thank you very much for the contribution you both made, and to the audience tonight for the questions. So thank you for being here. A reminder, if you're not already a member of the CES, go on the website and join. If you haven't already given an acceptance for the dinner, which is on the 15th of March, it'll be at the Hellenic Club. Genevieve Jacobs is a very capable and engaging speaker. It'll be a terrific night. It's only costing $50 for a 3-course meal. It'll be a wonderful evening. So if we don't see you at the dinner, we'll see you at the next session, which will be on the 18th of May. So thank you very much. Just one final thing. Thank you, Mark Stanbury, who has videoed tonight. It'll be up, the whole presentation, on our website in a few weeks' time. Thanks, Mark.